and today I'm going to be focusing specifically on how I've used it for collaborative essay writing. So just to get started, I've been involved in the English Australia Action Research Program this year, and I just wanted to give a shout out to that program because a lot of the ideas that I've used in today's presentation actually come from this book written by Anne Burns, who runs the program with Sophie. And I really like this description of action research because it's very much the approach that I took in terms of really reflecting on my own practice, on my students and what was happening in the classroom. And yeah, so to give you a bit of an idea about what I'm going to be presenting today, I'll take you through the background, talk a little bit about my specific context, why I chose to focus on collaborative writing, the kind of research questions that were coming up. For those that aren't familiar with Google Drive, or perhaps you've used it a lot, but maybe not so much for collaborative writing, I'll talk a little bit about how I used it to prepare for the tasks and some of the features that make it particularly useful for collaborative writing. And then I'll take you through a lesson that I designed for my students, and they were preparing for an in-class essay. So this is like a timed essay, and we'll look at the way that I used it for planning the actual writing process, as well as analysing a sample essay and how I've used it in terms of giving feedback to students as well. So to give you a bit of an idea about the background to this sort of action research project that I've been working on. I was teaching an English for academic purposes course. It's a direct entry program. So once the students had finished that, they would go into their bachelor or master's programs at CQU. So the level of that course is actually a B2 to B2 plus in the CEFA, or if you're more familiar with IELTS, it was intake was at about a 5.5 and outgoing at about a 6.0. That's how it's benchmarked. The students themselves, there were 17 students, quite a lot of diversity in the class, 8 nationalities, a nice balance of male and female students. The pathways, like I mentioned before, are both into bachelor as well as master's programs. And there were 5 different majors or fields that they were going into, from IT all the way through to accounting there, and 1 in health as well. In week 4 of this program, we had to transition from face-to-face to online. So, and that was obviously because of the first wave of COVID that hit Melbourne. We're in the second wave now, and the writing task, because I was teaching on Monday to Wednesday, it was my responsibility to support the students in developing their essay writing skills for 2 particular assignments. And the first one was a research essay, and the second one that I'm going to focus on today was the actual timed in-class essay, which was an argumentative for and against essay. And I was growing a little bit, getting a bit worried about the students, because after 4 weeks, I'd seen fairly limited improvement in their writing skills. And as we were transitioning to online, I was worried that some students might get left behind. So 2 things came up when I was reflecting on how I was teaching and what I wanted to do to improve the students' writing. The first one was, how can I encourage them to be more interactive? I was setting a lot of tasks where it was individual tasks, but then the other students would read another student's writing and then perhaps comment on it or reply in some way, but it wasn't very interactive. So I started to think a little bit about using a more collaborative approach. But the second question came about because I really didn't know whether or not that collaborative approach to writing would actually improve their essay writing or not. I guess a common fear is that some of the students might really excel and other students might get left behind because they're sort of relying on the more proficient students to write the essay for them. But that's not really what I found. So I started looking into the difference between, say, collaborative learning versus cooperative learning, and I found this definition from Richards and Smith particularly helpful in the sense that it allowed me to consider collaborative learning as a really broad approach. Essentially, it's group work. It's any form of group work that has a common goal. So as long as the students are working towards that common goal, for me, that was writing these essays, then that's my sort of definition of collaborative learning. And this one article by Lowe's and Pascarella also gave me a bit of confidence because they found some research in higher education that showed that there were these 4 main benefits of collaborative learning in higher education. The first one is that it actually improves academic achievement. The second one, that students were persistent in their studies, meaning that they were more likely to continue on with their studies if they were involved in collaborative learning. They were more open to diversity because the process of working in groups allowed them to collaborate with people from other countries, and it also led to increased cognitive motivation. So at that stage in week 5 of the course, we were using mainly Zoom and Microsoft Teams. And then I realized that Microsoft Teams was kind of limiting for me, possibly because I still wasn't very familiar with Microsoft Teams, not as familiar as Google Docs. But also I felt it was a bit like Facebook in the sense that students would post something that they had written, and sometimes that was either short or kind of too long, and other students would just sort of comment, but it wasn't very interactive. I didn't find it very interactive. So I chose Google Docs because I thought it might maximize that interaction when they're studying online. Secondly, I wanted to be able to monitor who was participating in the writing tasks because I didn't want anyone to get left behind. And then the third aspect that was particularly attractive for Google Docs is that I was looking for a more effective and efficient way of giving feedback. I was spending a lot of time giving individual feedback to students and getting a little bit exhausted in the process. So for those that are not familiar with Google Drive, or perhaps you've used it but not so much for collaborative writing, a couple of tips. The first one is I often set up student folders, and then in each folder I'll share that with the individual student. This is really helpful for individual tasks, but it's not very helpful when you're doing group or full class activities. So to save yourself time, set up a separate folder which is just for those group or class activities. Share it with all of the students, and then every time that you're uploading a new document, it's automatically shared with everyone. So you don't have to go, oh, you're in group 1, okay, I need to share it with these 4 students. Oh, group 2, I need to share it with those 4 students. Instead, just share it with everybody. Saves a lot of time that way. Secondly, in that folder, I did break it down in terms of weeks. And what I found is that when we were getting towards the end of the course, weeks 8 and 9, a lot of students were going back to week 6 or back to week 7 to activities that we'd done previously that they wanted to refer back to. And if you look here, one of these is not like the others. So if you notice, the second one here has a little W. That's because it's a Word document that has been uploaded to Google Drive. The others are Google Docs, and although they kind of look similar, you can see that it's got the extension of docx. Now, the importance of this is that when students, from a student perspective, when you click on that document, rather than opening the Google Doc, it's only going to give them a like a snapshot of that document, and then they're likely to actually download the document and start working in Word. Therefore, the other students can't see what they're doing there. So rather than uploading Word documents, it's important to convert all of your documents to Google Documents. How do you do that? So when you're in Drive, you can see the search function here. Go into the cog, the settings cog, and under general, you'll see the second one is converting uploads. Make sure that that is ticked. When you tick that, All of your Word documents will be converted to Google Docs. All of your PowerPoints will be converted to Google Slides, and all of your Excel files will be converted to Google Spreadsheets. If you don't do that, then the students can't edit it in Google Drive or in Google Docs. Another thing, from the student's perspective, when you share a document with your students, it doesn't go into their drive. It goes into this folder called Shared with Me. I like to train my students to transfer those documents into their drive. And to do that, they'll need to right click on the folder or the document that you shared with them, and then move to, and then check the My Drive. And the problem is that the Shared with Me folder is chronological. You can't order it. You can't take those documents and put them into subfolders, for instance. So that's another thing that I found was really important, so that students aren't getting lost. When you're collaborating, or when students are collaborating, sometimes there's that potential for somebody to accidentally delete something, and they're often, perhaps they're not looking for the undo button. But if this happens, there's an easy way to restore it. So as a teacher, if you shared something with some students and they don't know what's happened, they've lost the information, just click on this button here, or underlined section. What that brings up is the version history. So you can see this annoying student, Paul Williams, deleted on the 17th of July. And the original document was on the 15th of April, and that's this paragraph here that was written. So all you need to do is select the information that, that was originally there, and then restore that version. I kind of stumbled upon this as I was restoring at one time, and I noticed that what it was doing was highlighting which sections the students had written. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail there, but basically when you are in this part of Google Docs and you're looking at the version history, it's also possible to monitor who has contributed what information to your group task. And that way you know whether or not one student's doing it all on their own, or whether or not there's a nice balance that everybody is contributing to that task. Okay. So the writing task that I set for my students started by just giving them a topic. The topic I chose was the consumption of sugar is harmful for human health. Do you agree or disagree? And I shared these two articles. It was actually from the independent learning part of our curriculum. And the students had to do this for homework on Monday nights. Most of them had done it, not all. And the next day they had to be prepared to write an essay on this topic. From there, the next day, on the Tuesday, I got the students into Zoom and then into discussion breakouts groups. And for 20 to 30 minutes, they had to decide between them whether or not they'd argue for or against the topic. Then they had to identify the key arguments by highlighting it in green, and then decide whether or not they'd paraphrase or quote those extracts that I'd given them, and identify any kind of problems or arguments that couldn't be used in the essay. So this is an example of what the students highlighted here. So they chose 4, and I kind of half predicted that sugar is bad for your health. And these were the arguments from that article. One was that fat would be deposited on your waist, dementia, we'd have smaller brains, and it would increase the risk of cancer or weight gain. They decided the last one was too general. From there, they had to start writing their body paragraphs. Now, when you're in class and they're doing this face-to-face, I'm not sure if this happens with you, but when students are writing on pen and paper and it comes out just black and white, what typically happens is one student, and it's often the confident student, kind of takes control of that pen and decides what goes onto the paper and what doesn't. Whereas when you're in Google Docs, that doesn't happen because anybody can type at any pace. And in fact, what I noticed is that these students were kind of dividing and conquering. So some of them were saying, okay, you do the topic sentence, I'll do the first paraphrase. I've got some ideas on how to support that, and then I'll explain or evaluate the evidence that's given there. However, what made it even more important to me was that the students didn't stop at that. They actually read what the other students were writing, made sure that it was cohesive, and then went through and edited each other's work. So they started to peer correct. This is something that I've often found is very challenging in class, is to get students to peer check other students' writing. So then they wrote the introduction and conclusion, and the same thing happened. One student was writing the sort of background to the essay, another student was writing the thesis statement, and another student wrote the sort of outline of the essay. There were 4 students, and once again, there was one student that only wrote 3 words. And this is another advantage of this particular part of Google Docs, is that you can then comment or send that student a message in Zoom or something like that and say, hey, I noticed you didn't really contribute much to the introduction. What happened there? And they might tell you, oh no, it's okay. I was chatting with student B and we did that together, or something like that. But it can give you, as a teacher, a bit of an insight into what they're finding difficult, what areas, who's writing what, and what's actually going on while they're collaborating on this task. After that, I had already sort of predicted that they would argue for the argument, so I wrote against the argument, and the main reason was I wanted to show them that any topic, it's often possible to build an argument no matter whether you agree or disagree. But also I wanted them to have an opportunity to sort of compare their own essays to something that I had written. And I wanted to introduce the language that they had been studying that week and show them how they could integrate what they were learning in the book into the essays that they were writing. And hopefully that some of those features would end up in their final essay for their assessments. So the sort of key that I gave them was to sort of bold the topic sentences, underline any conjunctions, purple for discourse markers, yellow for maintaining unity, and relative pronouns were in green. And they sort of understood this because they had been doing it very explicitly that week in their program. Then I sort of had a bit of a backup. So this was my own sort of answer key. And so as I was sharing this with them, the students could see what I'd highlighted as the general statement, the lead-in, the thesis statement, the outline. And then for the body paragraphs, a lot of them had identified the conjunctions pretty well. And you can see, for instance, with the discourse markers, however, in other words, the relative pronouns, that and which, and the cohesion was just that link between the topic sentence and the keywords that we use throughout the paragraph. So that was also, while the students had sort of created their own model essay, they had this other essay that they could refer back to and see the difference perhaps between author prominence citations and information prominence citations, for example. After that, the students, because like I said before, some of the students weren't really contributing as much as I wanted. And this was one of the weakest students. The following week, I asked them all to write individually. And I wanted to see whether or not they could take that learning that they'd been doing in the collaborative learning lesson and apply it to their own essay. So I could see here that the student was able to integrate a paraphrase, that they could use a quote in the essay in the next paragraph, that they were using topic sentences much more effectively than this student was in the previous weeks. So I found that very reassuring. When I looked at the results, there was significant improvement in two main areas, and that was their organisation and referencing. So whereas their task completion and language, there was still improvement, but perhaps not as much as those two areas. Now, just keep in mind, I didn't have a control group. This is not, this is just observation of my own class. I can't generalize this across all courses or anything like that. But it did give me insight into my own teaching and a bit of an idea of what may be working. It's not proof. But then when I compared that to some of the student feedback, that came up again. A lot of the students commented that what they had learnt most was APA referencing, formal writing style, how to maintain unity in an essay, how to organise the essay. They also mentioned the improvement in their IT skills and specifically Zoom, Google Docs, Teams, and my co-teacher was using Flipgrid. And finally, also quite encouraging, was that they saw some value in what they were learning for when they were going on to their higher education courses and future career, that perhaps in the future they may be asked to use Zoom or asked to use Google Docs, and now they had a better understanding of how they could do that. So I guess the conclusions, coming back to my research questions or my sort of action research questions, what I wanted to know about my students. How can I encourage student interaction in the classroom? Well, Google, yes. What I'd like to do one day is try it with OneDrive. I'm not sure how it would go using Microsoft. I know there are some benefits to using OneDrive, so if you've used that before, I'd love to hear how it went. I firmly believe now that collaborative learning is certainly beneficial, but I would caution that it is very important to balance that with individual tasks as well. Will collaborative writing improve my students' ability? I can't say for sure, but I definitely noticed that in my own students. I think they had a better understanding of the genre of argument style essays. They learned from each other about the way that the other students were approaching that task. And they had a much better idea of the product as a whole. What a good essay would look like once it's finished. How many words would there be in a paragraph? How do you integrate information from a text into an essay? How do you evaluate it? That kind of thing. They learn a lot more about APA referencing this way. They improved in their language use and accuracy. And I also noticed that in subsequent tasks, when I asked them to do individual tasks, they seemed more motivated. They contributed more, and I think that was because they were more confident in their own essay writing capabilities. So these are the articles or books that I used in my presentation today. And I guess before we finish off, I thought I'd share this. I'll put it into the chat perhaps. I'm not sure. How can we? Maybe I need to stop share. Sorry, Sophie, I'm trying to work out how, oh, there we go.
Do you want me to pop something in for you?
Yeah, I can put it in here. I think I've got it. Nope.
Okay, I'll pop it in for you.
Oh, okay, that'd be great. And if there's any questions while we're going.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Paul. That was really interesting. I've used Google Docs for many years, and I've learnt a few things tonight. So, thank you so much for sharing that, and great name as well. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, and we've probably got time for a few, and then I'll leave them there for you to answer any extra ones. One of the questions there was, how would you rate students' competency with the Google Docs technology? Did you actually have to train them, and how much time did you spend training them?
Yeah, so this group, as I mentioned before, is a 5.5 to 6.0 in IELTS. So roughly perhaps upper intermediate, you might say, around that level. They really didn't have too many problems learning how to use Google when they had a laptop. But some students were originally trying to use it on their phone, and I think that that isn't as effective as when they're doing it on their laptop computers or doing it from home. So that's probably the main thing. But in terms of aside from the points that I raised in the presentation about when somebody's sharing the doc with them, a lot of them were just going to My Drive and they can't see where that document is. So once I'd sort of fixed that problem, I found that they had no real problems getting in and editing those documents and contributing to the writing for their group. So yeah.
Great.
So sorry, I've shared 3 links there. There's the first one is well, the first 3 are just sort of pretty plain Google documents for perhaps sharing some ideas about how we can use Google, how we can use collaborative writing. And if you wanted to give me some feedback, you can use that Google Doc there. The final one's a bit of fun. It's a critical reading activity that I use with my students to sort of spot the mistakes if you wanted to get in there and have a go. So, yeah.
No, that's great. Thanks. No, that's great. Thank you, Paul. Maybe we'll just put a couple more questions in. There's a number here, and I might just leave you here to answer them in the break. But one question was, how many weeks did it take you to cover this? This is from Delia. She said that she's got a 4-week sessions and she always runs out of time with her EAP class.
This was essentially 5 weeks. We did have a couple of weeks before that, but like I said, there hadn't really been much progress. It was really over 5 weeks.
Yeah. Okay. And one from Stuart here. Do you think having them write different parts of a paragraph helps them to focus more on maintaining cohesion? And do they chat through this? Do they work,
Yes.
online and chat?
Yes. So, yeah, I found that a bit like what Jared mentioned, spending all of the time on Zoom is not so great. But when the students are on Google and Zoom's still on, then they could talk in the breakout room while they're actually doing the activity in Google Docs. So therefore, they're not being taught through Zoom. What they're doing is they're utilizing Zoom as a way to socialize. And I think that's a very different situation. When you've got a teacher telling you lots of things and it's very teacher-centered, well, that's really different compared to when the students are focusing on a task and are using Zoom in order to chat with each other while they're typing. You can use Google to sort of chat with each other through writing, but I found that through Zoom, it was a much more natural interaction. Yeah, so that's how we did it.
That's fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much, Paul. A lot of positive comments coming through in the chat. I'm sure you can read those a little bit. We're going to take a 10-minute break now before we come into the Power Talk session. And Paul, if you don't mind just sort of staying here and having a look at the Q&A down the bottom and just putting some answers in there for any of those questions that we didn't get to.
Right.
That'd be fantastic. And grab a drink, grab something to nibble on, and we'll see you back in 10 minutes, 6:30. We're kicking off live from the UK.